Mademoiselle de Scudéry, one of the 17th century's greatest writers, was also in attendance at Fouquet's famous or infamous party, and she described her first impression of the garden thus. From the outside steps, there could be seen so many fountains and so many beautiful objects, one after another, and at so many distances that the eye was dazzled. Before me were spread immense beds of flowers surrounding fountains and circular ponds. From here, no matter which way I looked, my eyes were enchanted by fountains and their water shows. Water sprayed from countless statues in every direction, and an immense spread of water was covered with small painted boats, decorated in gold, by which we entered the great canal. The entertainment of the evening included the premiere of a hitherto little-known playwright, Jean-Baptiste Poquelin, now known as Molière, and a grand fireworks show, the first such show to take place during a non-military or royal event. Louis XIV was described as astonished and greatly admired the ingenuity of the artisans who built such a dreamlike place. But he also just barely resisted ordering Fouquet's arrest. Not only had Louis XIV's own finance minister, Colbert, been whispering against the creative accounting of Fouquet, but now Fouquet was so bold as to display his ill-got wealth to the whole world. What was much worse, however, was the fact that through the symbolism at play in his castle and gardens, he was setting himself as a rival to the king. It was a classic tragedy. The character forgets who they are, attempts to be something they are not, and suffers a terrible downfall as a result. While waiting to be named prime minister at his sumptuous castle, Fouquet was arrested by none other than D'Artagnan, the leader of the Three Musketeers. He had his day in court. Actually, he had almost 4 years in court. It was a very long trial. But at the end, his sentence of banishment was commuted by Louis XIV to life in prison, where one of his servants was Eustache d'Auger, who we, thanks to Voltaire, now know as the Man in the Iron Mask. So that was the end of Fouquet, but it was the beginning of Versailles. Louis XIV took all of the principal designers of Vaux-le-Vicomte castle, and even Molière, and put them to work on his father's old hunting lodge. Everything was bigger and better, but essentially based on the idea born at Vaux-le-Vicomte, which was to climb to the top, you must be at the center and make sure everything around you dazzles. The idea of dazzling is key here. The French term used at the time was éblouir. Éblouir means to dazzle, captivate, but more importantly at this time, to be ébloui was to be blinded by light. Louis XIV wanted to be this light. He was the Sun King, the light that would disorient and eventually reorient his people and the peoples of all other European countries around him in a sort of gravitational circle of dependence. This can be read in every inch of his castle at Versailles. He literally bent nature to his will, changing the course of rivers in order to provide water for his fountains, and importing trees from all over the world rather than waiting for them to grow to the correct height. His energy to outdo nature herself invited the best artists and decorators of his age to rival each other in ever more magnificent productions. When the parties finally began, they were beyond fabulous. The music was by Lully, the theater was by Molière, and La Fontaine was there to immortalize it all. Yes, Louis XIV had taken a page or maybe even a few chapters out of the book of his old finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, who by now was rotting away in prison with our favorite literary characters. But where did Fouquet pick up on this zeal for art, entertaining, and splendor? Here, we must quickly bring up the extremely important tradition of the French literary salon. The literary salon was a truly original institution in the history of France. It may have originated in Italy. However, except in France, there's no other country where it remained in place as a stable tradition for hundreds of years. We will have greater occasion to discuss the salon culture of France later in the course when we're talking more specifically about the art of conversation. But for now, we will touch upon it just briefly because as Versailles depended on Vaux-le-Vicomte, Vaux-le-Vicomte also depended on the salon culture. The literary salons were erudite spaces run by the most decorous women of France as an alternative to the royal court of the king. In comparison to the royal court, these meetings were very intimate. The first salon was run by the Marquise de Rambouillet, starting around 1610, and it took place primarily in La Chambre Bleue, or the Blue Bedroom, where her guests were seated between the wall and her very sumptuous bed, a space called La Ruelle, while she would remain reclining in her bed to receive all of her guests, all of whom were the most talented literary and artistic figures of the day. Why did this culture take root in France at this time? Madame de Rambouillet had been born in Rome and was married at the age of 11 or 12 to a Parisian marquis who was very high up in the king's household. Their mansion was situated in between the Louvre and what is now the Tuileries Garden, but at the time was the Tuileries Palace. Despite her status and wealth, she found Paris life and the king's court generally to be rather disagreeable and in bad taste. It was too coarse and too unrefined for her, and she decided to create a society based on decorum and aesthetic considerations that would refound the principles of polite society. In comparison to our day of Twitter and Snapchat, it may be impossible to overstate how important language and modes and styles of expression were to the salon goers, especially their venerable hostesses like Madame Rambouillet. Letter writing was a frenzy. The modern novel was invented in this space, and the art of conversation was perfected here. The ability to play with language, to encode it, to decode it, to manipulate it in order to create works of art that would form the taste of their society, all of these were matters of the utmost importance in the literary salon. The salonières, or hostesses, were all extremely well-educated and accomplished women who had mastered the art of conversation. These women would often introduce the most artistically or intellectually talented people to one another, and thus help arrange projects and collaborations that would then be vetted by the salon for quality before being published. This was obviously no idle activity or book club for bored housewives. The salons were building the rules of good taste. The highest value in this culture was the capacity for high-quality literary criticism that could detect the path forward for French taste. But a path forward for French taste. This would mean that in the salons, taste was no longer a matter of inheritance, but rather could be developed through education. Indeed, these spaces did not structure access simply according to blood and birth, but gave place to merit as well. In this way, the salons gave birth to the first great age of French literary reviews and criticisms. They were interested in codifying the different genres of artistic production, but not from a scholarly point of view. Feeling had to be courted on its own terms. Light, enchanting conversation was the only currency accepted in the salons, where right reason was to be detected only under a thick layer of right feeling. Early on, Fouquet had wisely surrounded himself with a coterie of these tastemakers. His best friend was the charming widow, Suzanne du Plessis-Bellière, whose literary salon put him into contact with many of the most famous artists and writers of the day, including Madame de Sévigné. His initiation in salon culture, especially as many of these women emerged from the Fronde years, the Civil War years, in which several of them actively participated and even directed military efforts, meant he understood the nexus of power at the intersection of aesthetics and politics. He believed that through a display of good taste, however excessive his projects may seem to us now, he could attract the assent of the many and might even be able to control them. This was the lesson that Fouquet had learned, in part, from the French Salon, and this was the great lesson that Louis XIV learned from Fouquet, after which Fouquet could do nothing more than disappear forever.